every American citizen must have an equal right to vote.
The administration of elections is primarily a state and local responsibility.
Whether you voted for the very first time or waited in line for a very long time, by the way, we have to fix that.
Welcome to High Turnout, Wide Margins. This is Brianna Lennon. I am the county clerk in Boone County, Missouri, and with me is my co-host,
Eric Fay, Director of Elections in St. Louis County, Missouri.
And we are very excited today to have Pam Fessler, who is recently retired from NPR, but has a long and illustrious career in covering elections, and we're really excited to talk to her today. So thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for inviting me and those very kind words.
How did you end up working in the elections beat in journalism?
Well, it started back in 2000. I mean, after the 2000 elections, one of the big questions obviously was going to be, what was the government going to do in response to it? Not only the federal government, but state and local governments. And we didn't have anybody else covering it. And I was one of the White House reporters at the time. I had also been covering the census and redistricting. So I was kind of a natural fit for it. I didn't really cover the 2000 election itself, but it was the aftermath. So when Congress started considering what became the Help America Vote Act, I'm the person who covered it. And my background, besides before I came to NPR, I worked for Congressional Quarterly. So I covered Congress for 13 years. So I was really familiar with that. And then I just became fascinated by this topic, this whole thing, how do you run as a country, run these elections, all these disparate elections offices with, this amazing feat that happens at the time. I thought, once every 2 years. I've since learned, of course, that it happens all the time, but it was extraordinary. And I'm kind of a nerd, a policy nerd. So this was kind of right up my alley, to tell you the truth. And I just loved meeting all these election officials and talking to people. And it was just so fascinating to me. So I became the voting and elections reporter at NPR. And I never wanted to give it up. I continued to cover other topics as well, but it turned out usually every other year, I would pick it up again. I didn't cover it consistently. Very few reporters did. And I just would never give it up. Even when I became like the Homeland Security reporter, I became the poverty reporter. This was just something really a topic I loved, quite frankly.
As an election administrator, I find myself on several occasions in some kind of setting, like in a courtroom or at a professional function with people who don't work in elections. So I find myself like explaining very basic things about how elections work to, judges when there's some kind of election challenge, or just the nuts and bolts stuff at the NPR headquarters, whatever that looks like, whatever that is it common for you to have to kind of explain to other reporters? Or do they come to you and ask you, are you a resource for other reporters at NPR, other, outlets about how elections actually work?
Very much so. I have to explain to editors, I had to. I think it's actually changed over the years. I think, honestly, what's happened especially since 2016, many more people have been focused on the logistics and how elections are run. But, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I really often had to explain the process to people, that they just, one, didn't understand that this was something that election officials worked on year round, and they certainly didn't understand the logistics of things like voter registration lists, how names get on them, how they're taken off them. They would hear, allegations that 500,000 people have been purged from a list, right? And they were saying, they would get outraged. And sometimes I would have to explain, well, no, that actually is part of the process. And I felt like, so I not only had to do that on the air for our listeners, but I did in fact have to do it within the newsroom and with editors. So which is why it was so great that NPR was willing to devote somebody's reporting to covering elections and over a sustained period of time, because I did in fact have that institutional knowledge. It took me a while to accumulate it, obviously, but it was very helpful. And then to explain to our other reporters around the country sometimes how things worked. But as you know, NPR is, we're a network. So we not only have the national network, which I worked for, the national NPR office. I'm based in Washington, D.C., but we have member stations all around the country. And many of them have very vibrant newsrooms and reporters. And those reporters, some of them really do cover elections very closely. And so I also learned a lot from them as well.
Do you think that's, especially after so much attention from the 2020 election, that there is a heightened interest, or has been over time, to understand it better?
Oh, very much so. I mean, very much. I think there was a spurt of interest after the 2000 elections, just because it was the first time that a lot of people realized, wow, just a few votes can make a big difference, and just a few problems with the logistics can make all the difference in the world. So there was a lot of attention then, but I do think it kind of lapsed through most of the 2000s into about 2014, 2015. But the last few elections, one, because of the threat of foreign interference, and then of course this incredible explosion of misinformation, news organizations have decided to devote so many more people and resources to this issue. And it's entirely different than when I started. There were times, probably for this 10, 15-year period, where I was the only reporter covering a lot of this. I would go to National Association of Secretary of State's meetings. I would go to local elections office. I would go to, even covering, remember when President Obama appointed his bipartisan commission after there were the long lines at the polls in, I can't remember, 2012, I think it was. The opening session of that meeting, I think I was the only reporter. There might have been somebody from the Associated Press. I mean, that's astonishing. Can you think of that happening now? I mean, every single thing that's going on with elections, and now certainly after the 2020 election and what's been going on in the last few months, there are tons of reporters covering that. And I think it's great. And there are tons of really good, especially local reporters, who have been covering some of these audits and recounts and these allegations of falsehoods. And I think it's wonderful. And it's one of the reasons why I felt a little bit more confident retiring, that there were lots of people who were good and really wanted to, I'd be interested actually in your perspective, but it seems to me that they really want to understand how the process works.
I think there really has been a renewed interest. I think there have been a lot of even new or local or student reporters have been wanting to figure out new ways to write stories on it, because they want to get in on the action while it's still something that's really interesting to read. One of the things that is always difficult when we get closer to election is we want to put out good voter education information. It's not very exciting. It's pretty boring stuff, deadlines for voter registration, how to vote absentee, and all of that. And those are not the things that are picked up. Are there ways that local election authorities can work better, especially with local journalists, to try to get more educational information out, or just build those relationships?
One of the things that I've always done at NPR is trying to tell stories through people, through individual. And you're right. I mean, you're not going to get a lot of attention just talking about something that's, quote, educational, because in a sense, that's not really a reporter's job for the most part. I mean, their job is to tell the news and trying to maybe elaborate for their audience how the process works and why. And I think what's most helpful is when election officials say, come on in, just spend a day with us. Do a story about exactly what we have to do from day, early in the morning till late at night. And obviously it's hard for you to do it on election day because you're so busy, or even the weeks preceding it. But maybe now. I mean, I think it'd be really interesting just to go through all of the logistics, and that this is what's involved. And we have two part-time people, who have to go through all of this mail, and we have to sort all this mail, and we have to check the voter registration list and look at this voter registration list, and this is how it works. I think people love those stories. And I think, quite frankly, because of all the misinformation and all the terrible, terrible, terrible attacks against election officials, nonpartisan election officials, I think it's important that you really have to come out and tell your story. This is who we are. We are public servants. We are the people who are trying to make democracy work. Instead of always being on the defensive saying, oh, this is wrong, this person said this is, this is not how it works. I think you almost have to, unfortunately, added to your other 8 million things that you have to do, you have to sell yourself for what you are. I mean, there were like amazing stories last year of what election officials went through and what they did. And I think the public would like to hear some of those, but in a personal way. So how you get your local reporter to tell those stories might be a different thing, but I would really offer to have them come in, come in and just develop a relationship so that when they do see something that they think, oh, this would make a great story, you already have that relationship and trust. One of the things that I have said repeatedly, and I've said it to my editors as well, one of the things I love about covering elections is I don't think I ever had any election official not talk to me. They wanted so much for me to understand what they did, why, and how the process worked. And that's wonderful. I mean, you don't get that covering a lot of government activities or anything as a journalist. But this seemed to be one area where, for the most part, the officials are like, yeah, please tell people this is what I do. I'm overworked, I'm underpaid. You might not word it like that, but that's basically what you're saying. I'm doing, this great work, but nobody's recognizing it. I think you have to be more promotional. Because what you do, and what's the big question right now, right? The big question right now is how much confidence does the American public have in their elections? And how do you sell that confidence? How do you address that confidence? We've just had one of the best run successful elections in history. And you have the most people ever doubting that it was a secure, accurate election. So what do? You just have to be, I think, more aggressive in selling the fact that our elections are incredible in so many ways. Of course, there are problems here and there, but it's nothing like what people think. Obviously, because of COVID, there were a lot more limitations this past year, but one of my favorite stories was I went up to Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, and I spent a whole day with them. And they let me in the office and just, basically the election director just said, just go do whatever, just go talk to people. And from one to some of the volunteers going through it, they were getting piles and piles of mail just to see what kinds of mail they were getting. The woman who went through the obits every single day and had this whole system for going through the voter records and talking about how when she'd been doing it for years, going through the obits so she could update the voter registration rolls. But she talked about, one, how many more obits there were because of COVID. And the other thing said that the hardest day she had was when she had to update her father's record because he had died. I think those things resonate with when people hear stuff like that. It really resonates. Like, these are just people who are doing a job, and they're just your neighbors. And she's trying to make sure that the voter registration rolls are up to date. So all these people who talk about, all this fraud and whatever, this is what's going on behind the scenes. Now, journalists do have to talk about the bad things too, and the problems, of which there are. But unfortunately, we have so much misinformation. We have to spend a lot of time now correcting that information first. Talk about covering elections. It seemed over this 20-year period that I did it, that every election, everybody was sort of anticipating the problem from the last election and working to try and fix it. And then some new problem would emerge that they hadn't thought about. And I always use that sort of as a cautionary message. You know, we were so worried about, you know, voting lines, and then, you know, or the technology, and then Russians decided to hack the election. Then we were worried about foreign interference, and all of a sudden we had, you know, all this domestic misinformation, including from the top of the US government. And so the question, and which are the issues that people are trying to address now. I know nobody is better prepared for the unexpected than election officials. But I do think of what is it that's going to happen in 2022 that we're not prepared for. And I think that that's something that journalists also have to kind of keep an eye open for and be prepared that, you know, everybody may be looking over here, but there might be another problem over here.
I really found it interesting how you mentioned that election administrators, at least from your experience, are very open to speaking with reporters and you in particular. Over the span of your time dealing with election administrators, have you noticed any change in them? And I don't know exactly what that means, but have they been more open, less open over time, or have their attitudes changed? Does it seem like people from different backgrounds? Just wondered if you observed anything like that over your time.
I don't think the openness has been any different. I do think that election administrators tend to be more, I think there's more of a professionalism about it at this point than there was maybe 20 years ago. And I think that's partly just because the responsibilities have expanded. I mean, before you had people who, you know, they were running elections, but, you know, some of them had been doing the same thing for years and years and years. And then you had the 2000 elections, and then, you know, this acquisition of all this electronic voting equipment. And then you had, you know, the voter with the technology. I think then so people had to acquire those skills. And then obviously you had all of a sudden, you know, the threat of foreign hacking and interference. And all of a sudden you had election officials who maybe never worried about this before having to know what, you know, phishing attacks were, you know, two-factor authentication was. So they had to get a whole new level of expertise. And now, of course, you have the, you know, the misinformation. How do you address all this misinformation? And what I just said, the added responsibility almost of having to sell yourself. I mean, that was really never something that election officials thought about much before, I believe. So anyway, what I've seen I think that many election officials have just layer upon layer upon layer about new responsibilities and then new expertise. And as I assume as election offices are hiring newer people and younger people, you are getting people who have, you know, a broader range of expertise.
Along those same lines, you mentioned, you know, you attend NAS meetings and things like that. If any, what is the difference to you when you deal with a local election administrator versus like a secretary of state or a statewide election official?
Well, I think for the most part, you know, the statewide ones have been elected. So they are also partly politicians. So there is that, whereas most of the local election officials, I mean, some obviously have you know, either partisan appointments or backgrounds, but for the most part they aren't. So you do get a little bit more partisanship at the state level. Although that's another thing, quite frankly, that always struck me, how nonpartisan those meetings often were. There might be one or two secretaries who were incredibly partisan, but for the most part, they were so collegial. I'm not sure that's going to be the case in future meetings. We'll see. It's hard to believe, since some secretaries in some states have questioned whether or not the others have run legitimate elections. But in the past, that was always something that I thought was quite striking and refreshing, quite frankly. The other aspect of what I covered was also voting rights. So besides dealing with the elections officials and the administration of elections, obviously there are all these interest groups and entities and nonprofits that also, had such a role in what our elections laws are and will be, and then also, how elections are conducted. And to me, that was another great part of this beat, to cover that. And part of that, the way I like to see it is I love to talk to voters, actual voters, and and tell those stories about what challenges they might have been up against trying to vote, because that's the way you also personalize it for the public, why this is so important.
You're talking to activists and you're talking to actual voters, and what's going on in the local election offices. How do you reconcile all that in your coverage when you're trying to point out really obvious flaws in the system, when you know what's happening behind the scenes too?
Right. So then I would try to truth squad what people were saying. So say I'm going to use the example of purges, that often people would mischaracterize what happened with voter registration rolls was either an intentional effort to try and take legitimate voters off the rolls versus this legitimate process to try and clean the voter rolls. And that was very difficult to explain, but I tried to do that whenever I could. The other thing was, the whole debate over voter identification, right? Trying to make it clear that when we're talking about the controversy, are we talking about just requiring voter ID or requiring some kind of a strict, very narrow list of identifications that many people might not have access to? And then the question of why was it required? And will making this requirement actually have any impact whatsoever on whether or not somebody could vote fraudulently? To me, it was always the most, quite frankly, one of the more bizarre arguments that somebody who was willing to commit a felony by voting fraudulently, pretending to be somebody else, isn't going to produce a fake ID. What election worker in this country could identify a fake ID? None, right? And it always struck me, and I would say that to some of the proponents of these strict voter ID laws, and there would be a silence. And then they would say, well, it's a deterrent. It's the same thing, the other argument that has just struck me as so ludicrous is the whole argument about drop boxes and the security of drop boxes. How are drop boxes less secure than a mailbox? There's it makes no sense. It's like, oh my God, we can't have these drop boxes because they're totally insecure. Well, what about the 8 million mailboxes? You don't have somebody watching them 24 hours. So it's that kind of thing that I would try. And so there's political debates in a lot of ways, but they're also logistical, administrative debates. So I would try and explain it as best I could and put it in both contexts.
One of the things I think you do so well, and really NPR in general, I think does so well, is explain things to people. What do you see as the future of the quality of explaining things? Because you said there's a rush of interest amongst journalists and news outlets to cover all things elections, but I still don't know that there are many that, when I'm driving to work in the morning, that I'm going to hear a 5-minute story from Pam Fessler about how all this stuff actually works. Is there a positive outlook there, or is there work that's going to need to be done to have the explaining things be of quality?
I am very encouraged that especially at NPR, we do have a lot of member station reporters who've been covering this issue, especially this election, I think really well. They've been at all of these, the recounts, they've just covered it very, very thoroughly, the legal cases, and hopefully that will continue. I think all news organizations are a little bit under the gun because of, just so much demand for we not only on the radio, we have to write digital stories, we do podcasts, but there's so many demands. So that does make it a little more difficult to go out to spend that time in person, say at an elections office or with voters or out on our voter registration drive and really get to know what's going on and to tell the story in a way that is engaging to listeners and readers. And I seriously think that the best way that you can tell those stories is through personal examples and individuals, because otherwise it becomes too abstract for people. You have to tell it to them. I mean, at least that's always been our theory at NPR. You just have to tell people's stories. And through those stories, get at the broader issue. Like I was thinking, one of my favorite stories, and this is back to the debate over voter ID laws. It was when they were debating new requirements in Pennsylvania. And I think this was probably about 8 years ago. And I decided to go with these women in Philadelphia, older women. They lived in an assisted living place, and they had to all get new ID. And they had to go to the DMV to get an ID because none of them drove. And I spent all day with them. They're elderly women. In this case, they were, I think, almost all Black. And they had been voting for decades. I mean, they were in their 70s, 80s. They had been voted, just forever. But they had to spend their entire day. They had a bus that came to pick them up. Some were in wheelchairs, some had canes. We went to the DMV. The DMV was mobbed. They had to wait there for hours. And anyway, so the whole story was about their effort to get this ID, just to do something that they had been doing for decades without any question, which I think really illustrated, okay, why are we requiring this? And there are people who, in fact, don't have the required ID. There's so many people who say, oh, it's so easy. Everybody has ID. I don't understand what the big deal is about. And that was a way to try and illustrate it in what I thought was a compelling way for our listeners. But you couldn't, I could have just told a story saying how difficult it was, but without those people and those women and their voices, it just doesn't resonate.
Have you ever seen an example of an election administrator try to convey information by using somebody's story, maybe a poll worker, or, try to recruit poll workers, use some existing poll worker that's done it a long time? And
I have not. Have you? I mean,
not really, but from hearing you now, it's making me think about that. So.
Yeah, I know most people are kind of modest. They don't really want to promote themselves, but I don't know. I kind of think you do, unfortunately. But that would be great, to do little snippets or profiles of some of the people who you think have done amazing stuff. I wrote a book a few years ago, and I took a leave of absence from NPR for a year. And I decided to use that opportunity, it was in 2018, to work as a poll worker, which I had never done, but I always wanted to do. And it was great. I mean, it was just, even for me, knowing all this stuff, I was overwhelmed by how complicated it was, but also just how great it was to sit there and have all these people come in and sign in, and you register them and talk to them. And then I guess they probably do this in a lot of places, but every time we'd get a voter who was over, 90 years old or whatever, or a first time voter, everybody would stand up and cheer. And it was great. It was just so wonderful. So it'd be nice to capture that for the general public. I mean, I'm kind of a mushy person, so I get, like teary-eyed about stuff like that, but a lot of people do. And I think we have to make Americans sort of proud again of this process that's really extraordinary.
So we have the True False Film Festival in Columbia. It always falls on the Friday before the voter registration deadline for the April municipal elections. And so we've always been open on that weekend for voter registration just in case. But wouldn't it be cool to have a little 5-minute documentary short about elections that could be, used at those types of festivals or different things to just make it interesting? Because otherwise our stories, I feel like, are unintentionally viral. Well, and not even the negative ones, but there had been some story about a TikTok that a clerk's office had done to say goodbye. And now I can't remember what state it was, but it was one of the states that had a very long serving Secretary of State, 30, 35 years or something like that. And they were all thanking the secretary for their service and had somehow uploaded it onto TikTok to send to them. Well, then it just became accidentally viral. And so everyone paid attention to elections offices for a second because they were doing this really cute, like heartfelt thank you to our Secretary of State's office, and people picked up on it, but they didn't do that on purpose. And those are the kinds of things that if we could intentionally do them would be really helpful.
I do think, and there's so many creative people around, that would be much more creative than I could think of that would know better how to do this. I think there was a brief period, about 4 years ago, where some of the secretaries were doing kind of funny ads, tongue-in-cheek ads about voter registration. I'm thinking of, I think it was Delbert Hosemann in Mississippi. Secretary said he was in a boat somewhere, and I can't remember what the joke was, but it was trying to get people to register to vote. I don't know how much traction that got, but it was a little bit something like, okay, it was just more upbeat and positive and not, as you say, like educational or instructional, like, oh, you need to do this, like eat your vegetables, you need to go vote. But like, this is fun, this is great.
All of the elections and all of the people that you've covered and things like that, do you have a favorite situation that happened? Because I mean, like, longtime election mysteries will always have that one election that happened that will stick with them forever. And, do you have anything like that?
Probably one of my most favorite things was when I followed a doctor. Her name is Dr. Brenda Williams in Sumter, South Carolina. And it was for a story about voter ID. And she and her husband worked with very, very poor patients, but they always, when they worked with their patients, they always said, are you registered to vote? And they would try and get their patients to register if they weren't. And they were very big on getting people to register. And I went with her. She used to go into the county jail and register people to vote. And she said, you want to come with me? Come on. She said, I registered a whole bunch of people. I'm going to give them their voter registration cards today. So we went to the county jail, because she knew the guy who ran the jail. We go into the middle of this cell block, and there are all these, the prisoners with their orange jumpsuits on. Dr. Williams is about 4'11". People were talking, she's just a little one. She belts out this spiritual at the top of her lungs, and all of a sudden there's silence, and everybody just stands there and waits. And she said, I am, remember last week I came, we registered you to vote. I'm here to give you your cards, your registration cards. And she did it almost like a college graduation. She would call up the name. This person came up and she would say, John Smith, you are now a registered voter in the United States of America. And everybody would applaud. And it was amazing. It was just like wonderful. And to me, that's what it's all about.
Okay, thanks everybody for listening to another episode of High Turnout, Wide Margins. And we really enjoyed having Pam Fessler, formerly of NPR fame, as our guest today. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you listen to the next episode of High Turnout, Wide Margins.